So, as discussed, things are kind of bad and scary right now. So, what do you say to kind of get away from that for just a moment? We talk about one of my personal most anticipated books of 2025, though you wouldn't have known that till this moment because I never actually posted my top anticipated of 2025 video. So, you're just going to have to live in the moment with me and discover it as we go. But as you surely saw, today we are going to be talking about Immortal by Sue Lynn Tan. Before we dive all the way in, hi, my name is Melody, and we talk about books and book adjacent things on this channel every Friday, or almost every Friday. Ideally every Friday we dive deeper into a specific book, and I would love for you to hang out more if that sounds of interest to you. I mean, I would love for you to hang out more if that doesn't sound of interest to you. I just don't really know what you get out of that situation. But let's go ahead and talk about this book. If you have been with me since 2022, which is wild, but I have been sitting on this channel talking into the ether about books for going on 5 years now. But Daughter of the Moon Goddess was one of my favorite books of 2022, and I believe it was Sue Lynn Tan's debut. Now, I have been sadly remiss since then in that I have the sequels to Daughter of the Moon Goddess and just have not got to them yet. I think at this point I need a reread going into that, but I was still so excited to have this new standalone that seemed to be really emphasizing the romance more in its marketing, as well as still living in that kind of immortal celestial realm that Daughter of the Moon Goddess lived in, because I loved exploring that world. Listen, one of my favorite things about both books, we're jumping the gun a little here, but is just the visual. And I know that this is more like folklore, but the visual of these gods and immortals riding around on clouds, I absolutely eat up. And something about the way that Tan specifically describes it, I just really love. But here we are a little outside of the realm of the celestial and the immortals as well. And we are following Lian, the young heir to a mortal realm, as she is on the run with her grandfather. It starts very actively. And we come to find out that she has been kind of chronically ill. She's never been very strong. She tires easily. She's always been a little sickly. However, in this moment, she has also been poisoned. And in wake of this, her grandfather, who has a tenuous, as the leader of this kingdom, this landlocked essentially kingdom that has been warded off from the rest of the mortal realm with an alliance with an immortal, the Queen of the Golden Desert. The Celestial Kingdom is mentioned, and they talk about the Emperor of the Celestial Kingdom in a way where I'm like, I need to go back and finish that series, because is it maybe now a character that we know a little bit more intimately? Probably. I don't know. Anyway, so they have this alliance due to attacks that were happening. The way that this mortal realm, this specific city, got kind of caught between these epic battles between the immortals. And in wake of this, they have pledged their allegiance and are kind of shielded off from the rest of the mortal realm, which is a sticking point over the course of the book. And so Lian's grandfather at the start of the book has been charged with acquiring this magic lotus blossom for the immortal queen. And in wake of Lian's poisoning, he gives it to her instead and tells her to hide that she has this lotus, because it essentially like merges with her and heals her. But because it's a magical flower, it is still something that could be taken, or more importantly, given. It cannot be physically taken from her, but she can give it with her heart. And so we start in this very active sense, and then Lian watches her grandfather be taken essentially, or go to the queen, the immortal queen, and when Lian is kind of peeking in, she watches her father suffer a heart attack, essentially. And so she blames the immortals for her grandfather's death, even if they didn't have as direct a hand in it, but just this idea of them and Lian and her realm being kind of at the mercy of the capriciousness of the gods. However, in the wake of the loss of her grandfather, she inherits the throne, and she isn't in charge of uniting this kingdom in whatever way, but also protecting it by essentially pledging herself to this queen again. And so she is collected by the god of war, who was there at the beginning of the book, and he takes her to the immortal realm, but he doesn't take her right to the queen. Instead, he takes her to his palace of sorts because something has happened and the queen cannot see her right away. And so there is this kind of sense of we are operating on borrowed time. And in the meantime, Leanne thinks that she can reclaim the shield that was part of this original pact and that she can basically free her kingdom from being under the thumb of these immortals. But as anticipated, things kind of quickly move outside of the realm of her control in a journey that takes us through the realms not only of the immortals and mortals, but also of the underworld as we watch Leanne kind of grapple with the political realities of this kingdom that she is put in charge of and how it is balanced between the conflict between these two immortal realms, while also dealing with growing feelings for the god of war and where exactly those are coming from and if she can trust him. So needless to say, absolutely up my alley, and I was excited to dive into this in wake of Daughter of the Moon Goddess because it felt in its description a little aged up in some ways from Daughter of the Moon Goddess. While both are adult titles, one of the things that drew me and I loved so much about Daughter of the Moon Goddess was that its language really was reminiscent of a fairy tale or a folk tale to me. And this very much lives in the same realm in some ways. It has those echoes of fairy tales and folk tales, especially with things like the imagery of flying around on clouds, though we have much less of that this time around. But that is still in play. However, I would argue that in some ways that was working against us in this book more than in Daughter of the Moon Goddess, because this was told through a first-person point of view, through Leanne's first-person point of view, and there were some distinct challenges with that point of view, even within the scope of the narrative. And I'm not gonna lie, at the beginning of the book, especially within the kind of visit to the immortal realm, though there was a lot of imagery in that I really loved, including putting this string bracelet around her wrist and it's symbolizing her trip to the immortal realm, but when it falls off, she must return to the mortal realm and she can never return to the immortal realm. I loved those kinds of details. However, because we were in Leanne's head, we had limited information. And this is a book that really worked around what limited information we had and the reveal of specific information. And I loved, and I don't want to just sit here and compare this to Daughter of the Moon Goddess, especially as it's a book that I've read like 3 years ago now, but a lot of the reveals in that were really successful to me, even if they were predictable at certain moments. And here, there was some of that as well. There were some twists and reveals and plotting that were incredibly satisfying, but I almost gave up. I mean, I didn't almost give up. I was going to read the book. But there were moments in the first third of the book where I was really frustrated. And while I can understand the way that information was presented in that first third, it's also the part of the book that is drawing me in as a reader. And I felt really disconnected from especially the characters and from being in Leanne's perspective particularly, because I mentioned that she had this kind of idea that she was going to get back this specific shield from this immortal realm, which sets up this really fun quest, right? I'm like, it's a little ill-advised, but I will allow it. But we went about it in this first third of the book in the most kind of barreling forward approach to things, where there was no nuance, there was no like allowing characters to kind of simmer or relationships to kind of develop. She really just went full force into what I considered the least advisable choices, like going directly to a wing of the palace that she had been specifically told not to go to. And that made me think that maybe we had kind of a Beauty and the Beast retelling here, which is not really what we ended up being in. And of course, I understand the minute you mention this thing that is off limits, of course, narratively, that's exactly where we're gonna go. But she did it with a particular bluntness that was almost offensive. Like, she's told not to go into this specific wing or this garden, and then she immediately starts asking the handmaidens that she's been given all about it, or asking very obvious questions to the god of war, where it's like, he's not stupid. He is immortal. Like, can you try and be a little bit more suave about it, I guess? And coming back to those moments from the end, I kind of understand, especially in terms of the pacing, because we still have so much ground to cover over the course of the book, especially kind of knowing and having the hindsight of how it's structured, with that first portion just being the immortal realm portion. And when I'm reading it, or when I was reading it, I was expecting that to be like a heavier or a heftier portion of the overall narrative that it didn't end up actually being. It was more kind of an introduction to this world. And I did really, really like that we had these three kind of separate sections of the narrative. And I also really liked some of the nuance that was added in later that the beginning lacked, in terms of exploring the motivations of the everyday person kind of trapped by the will of the gods, or those that just hold more power, and how a leader should behave and what a power-hungry leader can do. And there are a lot of really great parallels, again, in this book that reads very much like a fairy tale. But if we remember, fairy tales were told and created to teach lessons. And so there is a lesson in here still. But at the same time, our focus really is on Lian and really her relationship with the god of war at the end of the day. It is a romantasy at its heart, even if it has a lot of other elements built up around it, which I did appreciate. I just think, particularly, like I said, being in this first person perspective that was limited by what that character knew at any given time, and also being kind of trapped by the motivations necessary to get us to the next plot beats, it didn't feel as emotionally connected, or it didn't allow us to kind of sit in a lot of that emotion. And while a lot of the emotion and the kind of romance of it was aged up in a lot of ways, there was a lot of heat, there was a lot of angst and tension that I would have liked to see build out a little more, because, and I'm trying really hard not to spoil any of the reveals of this, but there were certain turns that the book took that left me feeling like it was a little bit more insta-lovey, even if, especially in that first third, there is this kind of sense or attempt of trying to make it more like enemies to lovers, and then kind of interrogating whether that's really the relationship going on and what exactly is going on between these two. But going back to that character development and that perspective, especially in that first third, which sets up the rest of the book, we don't really have a full sense. I, as a reader, felt like Lian read very young, and there was, over the course of the book, very much an intention of this being a narrative kind of exploring her coming into her own and stepping into her power and growing up in a way and finding love amidst that and discovering herself. However, then we also were reading and experiencing this epic love story from only the perspective of the person who has the least information. And I can understand why that was the perspective chosen. However, it still limits us, or then there are complications or challenges to that perspective that we have to face in whatever way. And I do think there were attempts to face this. I don't know that it was always as successful as I would have liked, because again, I felt like the emotional resonance kind of came up a little shallow for me here, even as we had this kind of epicness of scale, but it didn't feel like the first person perspective was always emotionally honest with the messiness. And I talk about this a lot, the emotional messiness, and it can reference complicated emotions without being willing to delve fully into that emotional messiness. And part of it, I think, while I love Sue Lynn Tan's kind of plotting and the turn she takes so much, it felt like we again were anticipating those moments, and we weren't allowed to really sit in the emotions of other sections, especially with the knowledge that more information would be revealed in the future. And I think that there's a way that that could still be utilized. Like, all of the plot beats are the same, but I think there was an opportunity to let that heighten the emotional stakes, and instead it felt like it was a deus ex machina a lot of the time. Though I guess if I say a lot of the time, it's not really a deus ex machina, because that would only be at the end. But this idea that it's an easy kind of narrative or emotional fix, instead of allowing that to kind of heighten the stakes as we go along and further complicate the choices that these characters are making, whether that be on the scale of their kingdoms or on the emotional scale, which is just as fraught and has the opportunity to be just as fraught. And instead, it felt like we were kind of given a lot of that information, especially after certain reveals, that I think it would have been fun to discover along with our characters, especially as it greatly shifts her perspective. And so instead of kind of discovering with her, we are watching her character shift very drastically in a way that's kind of hard to reconcile. And as a reader, if I am only in the perspective of my protagonist, I want to be rooting for her, but I don't fully know who she is over most of this book. There's an attempt to make her kind of feisty and fight back against the god of war or certain systems, especially within her own court. But for me, they fall kind of flat and feel more like an archetype, or more importantly, kind of this idea of a character that it feels like we're supposed to have in a fantasy like this. And I would have liked to see her be a little bit more grounded. And one of the ways I think that this would have been even more possible is we have this explored tension within her court and this idea that she has inherited the throne, but she is being undermined, particularly by two advisors who are kind of grappling to be the power behind the throne or to grasp power for themselves, and are really undermining her, especially as a young woman, and are going so far as to be recommending husbands for her right away. And of course, they are their sons or relatives or someone in their own pocket. And she shoots that down and is kind of playing politics in the court. And I love, love, love the instincts of this. And I wish we'd gotten to explore this even a little further, especially within the middle section that is really concerned with the mortal realm and kind of grounding us in Leanne's world and her reality and what she's fighting for amidst these other adventures. But instead, it sometimes feels like, of course, this is how she's going to behave because this is the proper way for a woman or a woman in power to behave, but we don't really get to see her grapple as much. And again, I love the moments we do get to see. I just would have liked to lean into that a little bit more. And I think, like I said, all of the instincts are here. For instance, the relationship at the center of this is, of course, right up my alley. And we have these delicious moments of jealousy from the god of war, especially when he comes to visit her in the mortal realm for reasons that will be clear to you when you read the book. But they are also clearly drawn to each other from the beginning. And I would have liked to see that built out a little bit more within that first kind of third, where I think that a lot of that emotional nuance could have been massaged a little bit to set us up more successfully for the rest of the book. Because as I kept reading, I was fully invested, and especially toward the end, it really picked up the pace. But a lot of things were happening to Leanne, which I understand. Like, things happen to characters and how they respond is the driver and the revealer of character and action, but I think it really did feel often like things were happening to her rather than she was kind of existing within this, which is interesting because, again, we were seeing things from that first person point of view. So to have that kind of narrative bluntness or that bluntness of action when we really dug into it was a little jarring sometimes. However, again, by the end of the book, I do think that a lot of that had smoothed out pretty significantly, but we did suffer from some info dumping at the end in terms of big reveals that I think could have been utilized better in terms, like I said before, of giving that a little bit more emotional gravitas, which would have fed directly into the kind of emotional stakes and gravitas of our central relationship as well, which was delightful, but did have these moments where it felt, like I said, kind of insta-lovey, and we were kind of taking it for granted that these two were attracted to each other. And I loved seeing them come head to head and be drawn to each other again and again, and exploring these kind of realms of trust and betrayal and whether we can gift our heart to someone and what that means, and taking versus being given. There is a lot to be said there, but I do think that even some of that exploration kind of falls to the wayside after certain reveals. And again, I'm trying to talk around a lot of things here, but while I appreciated that, I was like, oh, yeah, that was nice. I enjoyed that. Okay, I can see it. And it reframed a lot of the way information was perceived and delivered throughout the rest of the book. However, then we do still have to grapple with how to make us as readers invested in this journey throughout, and how we approach Leanne as a character with agency throughout, and what her goal is throughout this novel. I mean, she clearly has goals, do not get me wrong, but I think if we'd refined that a little bit better and lived in the emotional stakes outside of the emotional stakes being a device, but as a way to further forward the narrative, I think it would have been a little bit more successful, especially as the narrative goes on. The God of War loses his bite a little bit in the sense that his character starts to feel a little flatter toward the end of the book, which is a risk we take again when we're in this first person point of view. And Leon's story has a lot of ground to cover yet, and so he ends up kind of taking a back seat character development wise to that story, even as he is central to that story and the development going on there. It feels like, again, he becomes a little bit more of a vehicle for the reveals than a complex character. And it's hard, right? Because there are definitely elements of this that I remember from Daughter of the Moon Goddess, but it was much more successful for me there than it sometimes is here. And I don't know if it is that it feels more grounded and rooted in the mortal at times, though of course not throughout, as we spend a good 2/3 of the book in an immortal realm of some kind, and there is an abundance of magic. But I also think that there was just a little bit less suspension of disbelief in some of the maneuvering in that way. Maybe also too that the romance was presented and centralized a little bit more in the story. There is definitely a heavy romantic angle to Daughter of the Moon Goddess. I would never say otherwise. However, it really felt like this was framing a lot around this romance, even as the romance did not take center stage at the same time, which feels contradictory. I know. I feel like a lot of what I'm saying is probably contradictory, down to the fact that I still did enjoy this book. Still, if you were looking for a romantasy that leans more toward the side of fairy tale, I think that this would be right up your alley. I do commend it for taking a lot of narrative risks or approaching a story that is incredibly compelling but does have a lot of narrative challenges in the telling. How are you going to structure a story like this? What are the limitations of any way you structure a story like this? And so I think that there were a lot of really successful moments. I think that there are just also a lot of challenges inherent to the story being told itself. But if you've read this, I would love to hear your thoughts. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good. And yeah,